Wonderful, let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar from the Institute for Diversity Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm your host, Marcus Brower. I'm professor in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have secondary affiliations with the Wisconsin School of Business and the School of Medicine and Public Health, also at the University of Wisconsin. Finally, I'm the executive director of the Institute for Diversity Science in Madison. Today, we're going to talk broadly about inclusion and non-discrimination and whether one needs both to do effective pro-diversity work. This is our first webinar, and I'm so grateful to everyone who has registered, and especially to our three presenters. Dr. Tiffany Brannon, Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Kimberly Rios, Professor of Psychology at Ohio University. And finally, Ms. Angela Russell, Chief Diversity Officer at CUNA Mutual Group here in Madison, Wisconsin. Let me give you a quick overview of our webinar today. We're going to have a discussion format where we're going to ask our guests to respond to certain questions, and the goal will be to learn as much as we can in the first 45 minutes. Then we're going to go open it up for questions in the Q&A. And this is where you come in. We would ask you to type your questions into the Q&A box as we go along, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. One more note, if you can't stay for the whole webinar today, we're recording this, and we'll send out the recording to everyone who registered, and we hope to be able to do that by tomorrow. Okay. Let's get started. I'd like to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves. Angela, Tiffany, and Kim, could you please tell us what you do and anything else you'd like to share? Why don't we start out with Angela?
Hello, Marcus. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you on this webinar. It's an honor to be here. And one thing is that we recently changed our name. CUNA Mutual is now TruStage. We just changed our name like 2 or 3 weeks ago, so a lot of us are still getting used to it. So I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at TruStage. I've been at this organization for about 5 years. I'm originally from Peoria, Illinois, came to Madison for grad school and never left. Because I am a curious person, I would love for folks in the chat to just drop a line on where they're joining us from today. That's me, and I will turn it over to Dr. Brannon.
Great. Thank you, Angela. So good afternoon. I'm also really happy to be here. My name is Tiffany Brannon. I'm a faculty member at UCLA in the Department of Psychology. I direct the culture and the contact lab. I got my PhD in social psychology at Stanford University. I did a postdoc at Northwestern University in management and organizations. And I'm really dedicated to the work of thinking about inclusion and thinking about it from the perspective of both policy, but also the psychological experience of individuals as they inhabit mainstream institutions like schools and workplaces. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Marcus, and to the Institute for inviting me to speak here today and be part of this. I'm really honored. Once again, my name's Kimberly Rios. I'm a professor of psychology at Ohio University. I am originally from a suburb of San Diego, California. So I think where I grew up informs in large part what I study today. So this probably goes without saying, I study something related to a diversity science. My main interests center on how people with different social identities, which might be minority groups or majority groups in various contexts, navigate perceptions and feelings of threat from members of other groups. And the particular part of San Diego County where I grew up was extremely diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, and culture. There was no clear majority group, neither in my hometown nor at my high school. For me personally, I grew up in a multi-ethnic family. So my mother was born in Puerto Rico, and we grew up next door to my grandparents on my mom's side. So I was raised hearing both Spanish and English regularly in my household, but then would go to school and would largely be treated as non-Hispanic white. So that was an interesting experience, led to a lot of identity-related questions for me growing up. And when I found a research position as an undergraduate in college in a social psychology lab that focused on culture and stereotypes, it was a perfect fit for me. And that's the kind of work I've been doing ever since.
Amazing. Thank you, Angela, Tiffany, and Kim. I mean, the audience may not know that I know all three guest speakers, have known them for years. They're stars in their field, and all three of them do incredibly important work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, let's hear more about this work. So why don't we start out with Tiffany. Tiffany, in your work, you have proposed an approach to inclusion that you frame in terms of pride and prejudice. What's pride and prejudice? Please tell us more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so my work takes a pride and prejudice approach to inclusion. And so what it does is it builds on previous research in social psychology, in particular experimental social psychology, that I think has been really important in helping the field, but also helping policy to understand how to address stereotypes, how to address discrimination. And my work builds on that work to think about the importance of making individuals feel like when they're in a school setting, when they're in a workplace setting, okay, that they're not going to have to deal with the threat of being seen through a negative stereotype. That's very important, but that also identity, especially for historically marginalized groups, it's much broader than stereotypes, right? And that it's not enough often to just feel like, okay, I don't have to worry that I'm not going to be stereotyped here, that people also need to feel safe and like it's a welcoming environment when they enter school and workplace settings to bring parts of their identity, parts of their culture. And for groups that are negatively stereotyped, often those same groups that have the stereotypes, they're often tied to really important cultural knowledge, to an important sense of self, right? And that it's important for institutions to help individuals to feel like you don't have to worry about stereotypes in this environment, but also your full authentic self can be valued here, it can be respected here, it belongs here. And so in my work, we do a mixed methods approach, right? So we have studies where we look at data over time, we do experiments, we also look at qualitative data. And what we found, in particular looking at college students, so in particular looking at African American and Latinx college students, we look at, well, what's the experiences of pride and prejudice? So what's their experience of what we traditionally think about as prejudice? And we know that harms inclusion. So experiences, for instance, like hearing a derogatory remark about your group, how does that impact belonging over time? But then also recognizing that identity for all groups, but in particular for marginalized groups, is more than just the negative experiences of those identities, that often people have really rich sources of pride and resilience tied to those same identities. What are their identity related experiences like on college campuses that reinforce those pride experiences? So what are their experiences of taking classes that are related to African American and Latin or Latinx culture and history? What's their experiences of being part of cultural groups on campus? What's their experiences in living in dorms that celebrate the history and the culture of those groups? And what we find is that all of these experiences matter for belonging, right? Such that the experiences of being negatively stereotyped, so these experiences of perceived discrimination, they harm inclusion, and they harm it by harming how individuals are relating to outgroups, right? However, positive experiences that are tied to the culture and the history of being African American, for example, or being Latin or Latinx American, that those experiences, they actually promote broader institutional inclusion on college campuses. And they do so by forging a pathway to inclusion through feeling close to in-group others on campus. And I think one of the really cool takeaways about this work is not only that both of these types of experiences matter, and they matter in different ways for how they relate to in-group versus inter-group relations, but it suggests that both types of relations matter for inclusion, right? Like it matters that we help individuals from a variety of backgrounds have positive intergroup interactions. And how do we do that? It suggests the importance of policies and practices that seek to address prejudice, right, and discrimination. But it also suggests that it's important to create spaces where there can be learning, there can be acknowledgement about the culture, the history, the contemporary lived experiences of marginalized groups, and that those spaces can also be a pathway to belonging. And so that's what my work looks at. It's also very timely when we think about things that are happening in our country. But yeah, it looks at different pathways to belonging and why it's important to not simplify identity, both from the perspective of marginalized groups, but also it looks at, well, what are the intergroup benefits? So for people who don't identify as being part of a marginalized groups, what do they get from not just being exposed to, okay, don't stereotype, but what do they get from learning about the culture, the history, the contemporary lived experiences of groups that they're not a part of, but also groups that have this long experience of prejudice and discrimination. And what we find is that there are benefits for those groups too, such that it can lead to better intergroup interactions. It leads to reduce implicit bias, and it also can lead to other cognitive benefits for majority group members as well. So I'll stop there, but that's my work in a nutshell.
Thank you. That was super interesting. And I do entirely agree with you with highlighting the benefits and making these salient for everybody involved. Thank you so much. Kim, you've compared different types of approaches, one being the multiculturalism approach and one being the colorblind approach. Can you tell us a little more about your research and what you've learned here?
Sure. And I first want to say, Tiffany, I'm a big fan of your work and the Pride and Prejudice perspective. And as I read through some of your papers in more detail in preparation for this webinar, it struck me how much overlap and connection there is between some of the questions I've been investigating and some of the questions you are. So just to back up a little bit and to explain what is colorblindness and what is multiculturalism for those who are relatively less familiar with the jargon. So in general, these refer to approaches that institutions, organizations might take to whether and how to discuss differences, diversity between groups in order to improve intergroup harmony. So the multicultural approach will say differences between groups exist, they're meaningful and important, and they should be recognized, even celebrated. For example, by having multicultural festivals, recognizing different holidays, and so forth. Whereas the colorblind approach, I'll say colorblindness from the outset is a very, very complicated construct. Here, I'm going to focus on colorblindness in, I guess, its purest or most well-intentioned form. So in this form, colorblindness is more about still wanting to preserve or maintain intergroup harmony, but proposes a very different way of doing so. For example, proponents of colorblindness will say differences between groups aren't really that meaningful. What's really meaningful is what groups have in common or the individual characteristics that people have apart from their group memberships. Now, there is some other work in educational and counseling psychology on how colorblindness can also involve denying white privilege, denying that discrimination exists, and those sorts of things. But I don't really focus on those aspects of colorblindness because I think the strongest comparisons are between ideologies that have at its core positive intentions to improve intergroup harmony, which in theory, at least, both colorblindness and multiculturalism, as I've described them previously, do. But when I was in graduate school, actually, I started noticing that some social psychology research was coming out on how multiculturalism relative to colorblindness, when white Americans think about multiculturalism, they become less prejudiced against members of racial and ethnic minority groups on both implicit and explicit measures. But then, given that my PhD is actually from a business school in organizational behavior, I was reading a lot of management literature about how diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts can often backfire among dominant group members. And so I started thinking, given my interest in threat perceptions, whether there's something to this that for at least sometimes for white Americans, multiculturalism might elicit feelings of threat and actually backfire. So some of my early research with my colleagues suggested that white Americans who perceive their ethnicity and race as really important to their self-concept are more prejudiced when they're reminded of multiculturalism than colorblindness because they perceive multiculturalism as a greater threat to their group. For less identified white Americans, those who don't particularly see their race or ethnicity as important to their self-concept, they're actually less prejudiced in response to multiculturalism, see multiculturalism as less threatening. So this research suggested to us not that, so again, we recognize multiculturalism generally leads to, as some people I think are saying in the chat, more positive consequences than colorblindness. Colorblindness is not the solution because we know racial differences in privilege and lived experiences and disadvantage do exist, but we do have to figure out what to do about these subsets of the population, sometimes very large subsets of the population that are resistant to ideas of multiculturalism and diversity. And that's where I've come in, what my research has addressed in the past decade or so. And my lab has focused on ways to experimentally frame multiculturalism in ways that are relatively less threatening and make white Americans feel more included and more invested in these efforts, but without creating feelings of threat among people of color or those from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So in my lab, we're very invested in approaches to furthering support and appreciation for diversity, but still ensuring that nobody feels unsafe or uncomfortable and in the process. And furthermore, that dominant groups who might initially be resistant might come to feel they have more of a seat at the table and they're more invested in these efforts.
Great. Sorry, it took me a while to unmute myself. Fascinating work. I mean, we're struggling with the same issues in our pro-diversity interventions. We always pilot test every message, every video that we produce. And sometimes we have one video that appears as likely to be effective for members of certain groups, but then the message is offensive for people of other groups or threatening. So we go back and forth between members of marginalized and non-marginalized groups to find out what is a message that's not threatening for any of the groups. And it's sometimes hard to find that middle ground. Very interesting work. Let me move on. Angela, in your work at whatever the new name of your company is now, are there any key themes on how efforts that could be classified as either inclusion or non-discrimination have worked well? Do you focus on both in your work, or has there been a shift in the last 20 years? Have we only focused on discrimination 20 years ago, and now we only focus on inclusion? Tell us more about that, please.
Sure. Thank you. I'll answer that question directly and then give a kind of a broader view of my work. So yes, there's always some discrimination, anti-discrimination work, and that's part of our compliance part of our organization, not a part of our DEI. And to focus just on the compliance part is not going to get you to inclusion. I've got a little story about this. Several years ago, we had an intern who was working in, needed to use a motorized wheelchair. His name was Kramer, and he showed me how he could get in the building just fine, but he could not get it all the way in because there was push button accessibility that wasn't there. He needed to either take the elevator up and use a push button there, or take the elevator down and use a push button there. So when I went to facilities, I said, hey, we've got an issue. And their response to me is that we did what was compliant. So compliance does not equate to inclusion. And, we continue to learn that on a regular basis. In terms of our anti-discrimination and sexual harassment component, that's literally a video course that people take as part of being an employee at our organization. Our work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is far broader. So taking a step back, my background, my academic background is in biochemistry and in population health. I was trained to be an epidemiologist. And the reason why I'm so particularly passionate about this is that if you look at the social determinants of health, the key driver of the health of communities is financial and economic well-being. So the reason why I'm emphasizing that is my North Star. How do we increase access to financial inclusion for people that haven't had that in the past? And I'm emphasizing that because so many organizations that start on their DEI journey don't have a clear North Star. They think that's what they should be doing it, but are not clear on their why. So when I'm working with organizations, or our teams are working with organizations, we really say, what is your why? Is it because you just want to be the woke organization? Well, that's not going to do it, and it's going to go away in several years. We're clear on our why, and that why is actually tied into our mission now of helping more people in more ways access a brighter financial future. So that's one thing. Our DEI, actually, before I state the next thing, I'm really curious. My next question for the audience is, are you from a nonprofit? Are you from government? Are you from corporate? Are you from academia? Kind of what's your positionality and where you're joining us from today? So our DEI practice is a little bit broader than many organizations. We have 4 distinct components of our DEI practice at TruStage. One is our workforce diversity and belonging. The next is our corporate social responsibility. The next is our multicultural business strategy team. And the 4th that was just added this year was our environmental work. So if you think of like a Venn diagram, overlapping circles, what's in the center is equity. So how do you center equity in terms of our workforce diversity and belonging? How do we center equity with our philanthropic efforts in our multicultural business strategy and centering equity in all of this stuff as it relates to climate? If you think of one of our biggest products is insurance, property and casualty insurance. The folks that are going to be most impacted earliest by climate change are those who are already historically marginalized. So we have to center equity in how we're doing this work. I'll give you a couple of proof points of what's been working over the years. And I'm going to start with our multicultural business strategy team because it ties so closely to, Kim, what you were talking about in terms of why it's important to understand cultural differences. So we have a variety of products and services. One of them is being life insurance. When you sign up for life insurance, you'll get a letter back to say, who are those beneficiaries, right? For a long time, we'd get calls back because we'd only list the top 2 beneficiaries because we had historically defined family as a white family. 2 adults, 2 children, no one else is part of that family. So we're getting all these calls and saying, hey, you're not listing my beneficiaries. We tried something out to say, what if we actually worked with our employee resource group, our ERG, which is also a huge source of pride for a lot of folks. So tying that back in, Tiffany, and our frontline call centers staff to say, hey, what do you think is going on? And they're like, we may be defining family incorrectly. So our automated letter, instead of listing 2, started listing 4, and our call volume dropped and we saved millions of dollars, right? So that definition of how we define our consumer and how they define family by cultural difference really matters. And it wasn't until we actually had this intentional practice of DEI across the organization that we began to understand that. Our workforce diversity and belonging team has 13 different affinity groups. And they are such a huge source of pride for people who are in those groups, but also for our organization in general. They each have a budget and they're funded annually and do a variety of activities, not only to bolster that group in pride in their own group, but to actually help connect the dots between our increasingly more diverse consumer base as well. We know that involvement in our ERGs has actually increased overall employee engagement and employee satisfaction, which is also a big deal. It's not to say that we don't get naysayers. We absolutely have naysayers. And that's part of it. When I first started, someone told me, if you don't get any pushback, it means you're not pushing hard enough. And I'm like, all right, cool, bring on the pushback. And we get it pretty consistently, but it's part of it. In terms of our philanthropy, historically, so many philanthropic organizations have had this power over mentality of, we are the funder and we are going to dictate to you, poor community group, what you should be doing and how you should be measuring it. And we started doing a deep dive into the work of Edgar Villanueva, who wrote the book Decolonizing Wealth, and talked about the history of white supremacy in philanthropic organizations. And based on his work, we have really changed how we partner with communities. We don't act like we're the smartest in the room. We want to be partners, but we think that our community groups know best how to address the problems that they're on the front lines of. So we don't say you need to be doing this, we need to be doing this, and tell us what, and these are the things that you need to be measuring. We say, what do you think you should be doing, and what are the measures that are most meaningful to you? And that's actually helped gain a lot of trust in our organizations, with mutual trust in our organizations, which is really helpful. And we're just really starting on our ESG, environmental, social, and governance journey right now.
Wow. When I listen to you, Angela, I wonder whether our listeners know about your company. Could you say a little more about your company, like number of employees, and is it a multi-site company, or is all of your employees here in Madison?
Okay, yes, sure. TruStage is a national company. We've got right around 4,500 employees. About 1,200 of those employees are based in Madison. The rest are elsewhere. We grew up through the credit union movement, the cooperative movement. So we initially were begun to provide financial products and services to credit unions and their members. We still do that, and we also provide direct to consumer products as well.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Great, thanks.
Fascinating. Let's dive into some of these issues a little deeper. Kim, you talked about multiculturalism, and that there are sort of different views of multiculturalism, sort of a narrow view and then a more broader view. And if I understand your work right, the broader view is a little more acceptable for dominant group members. Could you elaborate on that and tell us more what you found and what it means to have a broad view of multiculturalism?
Yeah, so I think it can mean different things in different contexts. There is some prior work that suggested dominant group members, so white people in the US, might be more supportive of multiculturalism to the extent that they feel it's relevant to them, benefits them, includes them. But the big question that my collaborators and I have come across is, well, why? What might it be about multiculturalism that produces or does not produce these effects? And are there ways to tweak descriptions of multiculturalism to make it to make sure that members of all groups know that it can be applicable to and beneficial to them? And first, let me preface everything I'm about to say with, I often get this question in talks: why study dominant group members' attitudes in the first place? And I will say that for better or worse, white people in the US still hold disproportionate positions of power, and though not for very long, are still the majority in our country. And if we're encountering a lot of pushback to DEI and multiculturalism initiatives among such a large subset of the population, then that indicates that something different has to happen in order for real change to be made. And so last year, one of my colleagues, Adam Cohen, who's actually a psychologist of religion, and I published a paper in Social Issues and Policy Review, where when Adam and I were having some off-the-record discussions related to diversity issues within our own field, and realized that virtually all of the work on colorblind and multicultural ideologies focuses on appreciation and acknowledgement of racial, ethnic, and cultural differences, and doesn't talk at all. Well, there's a limited amount of research that talks about gender blind versus gender aware policies and ideologies. So if it's beneficial for, say, women, for gender differences to be acknowledged in STEM and in leadership versus minimized. But that's the only kind of research we could find on any groups other than racial, ethnic, and national groups. And so we started thinking about what might be the consequences of in multicultural initiatives explicitly highlighting the fact that there are many different forms of diversity, and these forms of diversity are important to acknowledge, to appreciate in various contexts. Now, we encountered some challenges in thinking and writing about this because we didn't want, and our position has never been, oh, let's de-emphasize race and ethnicity and make sure that other identities are given more airtime. That's not how we feel at all. Race and ethnicity and culture are very, very important to acknowledge. We're just arguing it's not necessarily a zero-sum thing. And a lot of organizations already do this. In my professional society, major professional organization, SPSP, that's Society for Personality and Social Psychology, we give out diversity travel awards every year to graduate students from underrepresented backgrounds. And we explicitly say students are eligible if they come from underrepresented racial, ethnic groups, gender identities, disability status, socioeconomic status, and so forth. So in large part, a lot of organizations are already doing this. But in the paper that Adam and I wrote, we explicitly made the case for how and why this broader approach to multiculturalism might be beneficial not only to dominant group members, but also for non-dominant group members and for intergroup relations. So for dominant group members, we make arguments that in the paper that it can have the effects of increasing feelings of inclusion and investment in multiculturalism and diversity. But we also argue for non-dominant group members that it can potentially reduce feelings of being othered, being stereotyped based on one specific identity, feeling tokenized, like you're treated in a certain way solely because of one identity that you have. Because in our approach, we explicitly acknowledge that many of us come from at least some identities that are relatively privileged, or some backgrounds that are, and some backgrounds that are relatively not. And let's start having more open conversations about our differences in backgrounds, identities, and lived experiences to truly understand one another. And I think ultimately, much like Tiffany's work shows with the Pride and Prejudice approach, this can prove beneficial for intergroup relations. And some of our very preliminary data, which are not published yet, so I'm providing a little spoiler alert here, do point to some encouraging consequences of this multiple forms approach for both white people and people of color in the US.
Thank you, Kim. Very interesting research. We can't wait to hear you talk. I can't wait to hear you talk at the next conference and actually present those data. My next question is for Angela, but I want to mention at this point to the audience, if you have any questions, if you want to make any comments, please type them in the Q&A, and then we can address those in the last 15 minutes of this seminar. So while first Angela and then Tiffany are going to talk, please start typing in questions that you want to share and that you want us to address. Angela, one thing we see in diversity science research is how incredibly important it is to have leadership buy-in and the right communication to making inclusion and non-discrimination efforts work. Can you share a little bit your experience, maybe also the experiences of other chief diversity officers you have talked to about how that works? How do you get leadership buy-in But then also maybe you have concrete advice for people who are in leadership roles of how they can provide that buy-in, or what would be the roles that they should be taking on and how they can contribute positively to diversity efforts. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Thanks. A few thoughts on that. So one of the things that our current CEO, and we're not only are we changing names, we're also transitioning CEOs, a lot of change happening. But one of the things that our current CEO did when he became CEO was that he named inclusion as a corporate value. And having named inclusion as a corporate value set the stage for what was to come. And so he set that even before he had anyone to do the actual DEI work, but probably by a good year. And so setting that stage really helped. The other kind of thing, and I don't want to minimize it because I actually think it's important, is when I started, I was a team of 1. Now we're a team of 21, which is also kind of rare for DEI teams in corporate, but team of 1. And I was not from the insurance industry, not from corporate. And I actually needed a white guy to say the same exact things that I was saying in order for it to get traction inside the company. He had been at the company for like 20 some years. He was a director at the company. I started as manager, and he, using his privilege, saying the same exact things as I was saying, actually provided a little bit more traction for me to get a foothold in where we needed to go moving forward. Now, was it annoying? Absolutely. Yeah, Eric Hansing, thank you. Was it annoying? Absolutely, because I'm like, this is my background. But the reality is, in corporate America, in insurance, white guys may have a little bit more privilege than me. I have short Black girl privilege, but that's not the kind of privilege I needed for the work to get done internally. The other thing that we have is a DEI council. So that's mostly vice presidents and above that gather regularly to talk about how they are working to embed DEI across in their particular part of the organization regularly. That's another thing. Another thing that's important is while I don't report directly to the CEO, DEI is not a part of the HR function. It's a part of our enterprise services function. And I have a quarterly one-on-one with the CEO. So I have that access as well. With our DEI council, not only are they reporting back on what they're doing, we also use them as key spokesfolks. So for example, we have a pretty robust DEI learning series where we bring in a variety of speakers. We've had like Jane Elliott, the woman who wrote White Fragility, with Edgar Villanueva, a whole variety of folks. And we actually intentionally have leadership folks, VPs and above, do the introduction of the people before they give their talk. And the reason why we're intentional about that is that we want folks to learn deeper on their own journey in order to introduce them to our employee base. Our DEI learning series has become a kind of a cool cultural artifact of our organization. It's not mandatory. When we started bringing in these speakers, we had maybe 300 people max attending. And now it's because it's become such a thing, we generally have right around 2,000 folks attending. Again, not mandatory, just because people are interested and a little bit of FOMO. So in addition, a few years ago, we don't have this anymore. We had a people leader goal regarding engagement around DEI. So it was automatic in our Workday system. Are you talking to your employees about DEI on a regular basis? If not, why not? Those are just a few thoughts.
I love the idea of creating FOMO. I want people to have FOMO when they don't take part in the webinars of the Institute for Diversity Science. Let me switch to Tiffany. Tiffany, when it comes to implementation of inclusion efforts, what are some of the lessons that your work offers? So you framed it in terms of pride and prejudice. Could you give concrete examples what that means, maybe even in educational settings or in private companies? How can you promote pride and prejudice? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there are lots of ways to address prejudice and discrimination, and I think wonderful examples. I loved hearing that example from Angela of like 2,000 attendees, and I think that to me that really resonates. Like when people really get the opportunity to learn about different groups, and the ones that they're a part of and ones that they aren't, that usually the experience is actually very positive. It's immersive. It's engaging. It is enjoyable there, and as well as there are opportunities to grow as well. It's not just about being positive. But I think some of the challenges for implementing, I think, best policies for addressing prejudice, but also acknowledging and valuing pride that groups can have tied to their identity. I think some of those in the present moment right now have been zero-sum thinking, right? So thinking that, well, if we do something that's going to, give representation to one group, surely that must come at a cost to another group, right? So we can think about this in popular culture, such as like last month, The Little Mermaid came out, and there was the trending hashtag "Not My Mermaid," right? So in the same moment that there was all of this pride about, oh, there's going to be increased representation, there's going to be opportunities for girls and women and people of color to see themselves represented as a Disney princess, there was also the idea that, oh, well, this must inherently exclude some individuals. And I think, and so for implementation purposes in my own research, that's something that I work really hard to address, because it's often not true. That often what it means to bring in ideas, representation, cultural practices tied to especially groups that have not often been represented in the mainstream is that it does not inherently come at a cost to groups that have been more represented historically. And in fact, when there are genuine opportunities to engage with those practices, to learn about them, to get context around them, that people do get to learn, they get to see themselves, they get to see people that aren't themselves. But it is an opportunity for inclusion across groups. So I just think that's a really important implementation challenge in this moment, is getting people to actually look at the actual evidence, which actually goes against zero-sum thinking, right? That you're replacing one group with the other. That in fact, that a lot of these inclusion efforts, they have benefits across groups, which is really important. And I would add, to Kimberly's point earlier about why study dominant groups, in addition to that dominant groups have a lot of power, is that if you also fundamentally care about the inclusion of marginalized groups, we have to recognize how often these mainstream spaces that we're talking about that are gateway institutions like school and workplaces, they're also inherently intergroup settings, right? Where it matters that people treat you who are already in that setting like you belong. And of course, it matters that everybody feels as though they belong. And so I just think so far for me, the implementation challenges have been around misinformation, which is just not consistent with the science, and as well as the zero-sum thinking.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, that's fine. No, I can end it there because I'm looking at the time.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. I love the fact that you're insisting on the science. I entirely agree with you. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There is a lot of wrong conceptions that are entirely contradicted by empirical research in the field of diversity science. And I love the fact that you highlighted it's not a zero-sum game, and multiple groups, both dominant group members and non-dominant group members, can benefit from certain initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you so much for insisting on that. Okay, well, let's move to the Q&A. Several questions were posted. I think some of them can be seen by everyone. Others can be seen only by me and the panelists. So let me start out with the first question by Deborah Phillips. I'm going to read it out loud here. So this one is for Kimberly. I've been having very interesting conversations recently with people about different kinds of diversity. How do I acknowledge the incredible importance of race while also including other kinds of diversity and not offend people? I think that's a great question. Deborah, I have exactly the same question. Kim will give us the answer.
Well, I definitely have thoughts on this. And again, thank you for that question, because it's something that Adam and I really thought about and struggled with in our desire to articulate this potential approach to multiculturalism and diversity. And one thing that we really landed on that we thought was critical to not offending people or not getting the wrong message across, opposite of what we intended, was to appropriately define diversity. So diversity can be defined in as specific to, say, race or ethnicity, or as including personality traits, right or left-handedness, political views, all these other things. And in fact, in experimental psychology, there was a debate, a controversy that happened about 6 months ago that I won't go into, but it was essentially a group of researchers who were trying to de-emphasize the importance of studying race and saying, well, if we study race, then why don't we study these 200 other forms of diversity? And we wanted to make it very clear that that is not the position that we hold. And in order to do that, we were careful and measured about how do we define diversity. And in our paper, we landed on the notion that diversity and differences between groups that are acknowledged in this approach should be groups that are historically associated with privilege and disadvantage in society. And so thinking about, say, political views as an example, there's also some research about, well, should political views be a form of diversity that we acknowledge and that we care about in DEI initiatives? And our position in the paper was probably not for our purposes, because although sometimes Democrats or Republicans might feel like a minority or marginalized in certain contexts, it's harder to make a case for members of either political persuasion being systematically encountering lived experiences of oppression throughout their lives. And so we said, well, no, in our case, this doesn't count, but that said, if you're in a hiring position and you're reluctant to hire somebody from a different political background, maybe ask yourself why and think about other forms of diversity it could be connected to. So again, we focused on demographic groups that have this history of privilege and oppression. And indeed, Terry Kirby, who's a professor over at Purdue, whose research I'm a big fan of, I know there's some Purdue folks here, has a really interesting paper that just came out on if diversity is defined too broadly, like as including personality and intelligence and these other things that are not about differences between groups or social identities, then that can actually backfire among marginalized group members. So again, we wanted to be really careful not to make that the message we were getting across. And we're heartened that our initial empirical evidence suggests that members of both dominant and non-dominant groups do not seem to be any more offended by the multiple forms of diversity approach than they are to a diversity approach that is just about race and ethnicity. We're really heartened that they seem to have similar effects and look forward to doing future research to further unpack this phenomenon.
I just have an additional kind of thought is doing this work, inherently you're going to offend someone. It's just part of it. What people are offended by is slightly out of our control. This is why I'm in therapy. I think a good DEI practitioner always has to have a good therapist, always. But I mean, that's part of it. And the other thing for us is that we actually had to get grounded in why is race a problem? And I think that and how does it connect to our mission? One of the things that we use heavily is a PBS series, Race, the Power of an Illusion. And the number of people in this financial organization that didn't know about the history of redlining and how that connects to financial well-being was stunning to me. So you're giving historical context as to why this matters, but not shaming or blaming, but saying we have a role to play in like changing and shifting outcomes for people over time.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question, is by Cheryl Fitzpatrick. Context matters. There are not DEI initiatives in companies and educational institutions, but these institutions and companies are in states, and there are differences between states in the United States with regard to how diversity is valued and how that DEI work is supported. So Cheryl's question is, what are DEI strategies for individuals, families, and organizations in states that do not support DEI work and that do not seem to value diversity?
I could jump in on this because this is stuff that, because we are a national company, we do have folks in a lot of different states, and we have customers, including credit unions that are in a variety of states, is that, and this is strategic, part of our DEI council includes attorneys. We work very, very closely with our legal counsel. So for example, we had a credit union who had employees in a state, Florida, that they wanted to get some education around DEI, but they're like, we're in Florida. So our employees live in Florida. What does that mean? So we get our legal team involved and have them really pay attention to what's legal, what's not, because this was not a mandatory training, we could provide it, but it does vary on a state by state basis. And it goes broader than just like what we're providing in terms of training. It connects to our benefits packages, and it connects to our products and services. So for example, when all of the abortion stuff was going on, and it's not legal in Wisconsin to get certain reproductive health care, what do we do for our employees to make sure that our employees that need access to reproductive health care can still access it in states where it's legal? The other definition, and then we're paying attention to that, because also if the definition of life changes, that inherently opens a can of worms of how do we define life as relates to life insurance products. So these are things that we're paying attention to on a regular basis. In fact, after this meeting, we have a team called the Complex Social Topics team, where we're looking at all of the legislation, all of the political narrative, state by state and federally, to see how it connects to what we do as it relates to DEI, our consumers, and the whole thing.
Thank you. I don't know, Kim and Tiffany, is there anything you want to chime in? Different states, how do you implement pro-diversity initiatives when the larger context is not supportive?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I agree, context absolutely matters. And I work in California, but I'm originally from the state of Florida. And so I think about this a lot. And I would say the individual who posed the question, acts at different levels. So what can individuals do? So I think if you're an individual in a state where there are laws that restrict what maybe your children are exposed to in classrooms, what can be done in your workplaces, is then I think it's important to expose yourself to information at home, right? Like to be a part of initiatives that are going against book bans, to read the science, right? Because a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of misrepresentation. And in fact, the things that my research would suggest are the most powerful and the most important for young children, such as exposure to literature that has diverse perspectives. There are lots of schools where those books are not allowed. And so I would say in the home environment, it's extraordinarily important to expose your children to those books. And it's not lost on me as I say this, like it feels like kind of like we're going backwards in time, right? Because for a lot of groups, this is a long socialization practice, is a long history of of knowing that there's going to be experiences that children are going to have in schools, and to try to counteract those experiences in the home to teach them a different narrative. And now, unfortunately, that seems more important than ever, but across groups to do that, right? To make sure that that children, and if you're not a child, if you're an adult, that you're exposed to information that's accurately representing groups and accurately representing the science behind these groups. So I think there's a lot that individuals can do, but we are, I think, in a really important context, as the question suggests, where as a researcher, for me, that context means that there really has to be more evidence and more accountability to demonstrate the benefits of what I talked about earlier, of the zero-sum benefits, right? That the benefits are across groups. I think a lot of the context that has gone into saying, oh, well, we shouldn't teach books because maybe they make some groups feel ashamed, that a lot of that is actually rooted in stereotypes, right? And so it treats groups like, oh, how sad it must be to be a part of those groups, versus recognizing that, yes, many of those groups have experienced extraordinary oppression, but guess what? They've also developed extraordinary resilience, and there's messages of resilience that can be really impactful for everybody to know about as we navigate life today, but also navigate intergroup interactions. So I just think at the individual level, there's so much that can be done through supporting book initiatives and exposing your own self and your families to books. But as a researcher, the context means that while the heat is on to get the evidence, right, to really show, I think what a lot of this misinformation is suggesting, which we know is just not true, but to get that at a larger scale. Like, what is the potential harm of these policies that are happening in certain states?
I can't believe we only have an hour, because I actually could spend hours listening to you. I find it absolutely fascinating what you have to say. So we have a few minutes left here. At the very end, in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to maybe have a 30-second pitch of what take-home message they have. If there's one thought that you want the audience to leave with, what would that one thought be? In the meantime, I want to spend like a minute maybe giving a pitch for the Institute for Diversity Science here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is a new research institute. The institute chair is Dr. Angela Byers-Winston. I'm the executive director of this institute. Angela and my goal is to promote rigorous scientific research on questions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to promote research in all fields, have colleagues from all fields getting involved: School of Medicine and Public Health, the Business School, School for Social Work, Agriculture and Life Sciences, College of Engineering, et cetera. So we want to have all disciplines represented, because diversity related issues are relevant in all of these fields. And finally, what we're hoping is that we go a little bit beyond just demonstrating disparities. We also would like to examine the causes that either contribute to these disparities or maintain them, or maybe that decrease these disparities. And then we hope that that knowledge can be used one day to design interventions or policy changes, et cetera, to make this world a better place, to promote inclusion, diversity and inclusion, and to create spaces where everybody feels welcome and respected and can strive. So that is the Institute for Diversity Science at the University of Wisconsin. And if you're interested, please go on our website, ids.wisc.edu, and I put the website in the chat. Okay, let me start out with Kim. Kim, do you have a 15 or 30-second pitch with your take-home message?
Yes, so I have two very brief take-homes. Number one, diversity can be relevant to everyone, and it comes in many different forms and social identities, but we do have to be cognizant of striking an appropriate balance between broad and narrow definitions of diversity. And number two, diversity doesn't have to be perceived as a threat. It is a challenge in many situations and in many aspects, but it's also an opportunity for all of us to learn from each other.
Thank you. Tiffany, any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually want to second Kimberly's last thought, right? That diversity is an opportunity, right? There's opportunities for us to learn from each other. And I think in this moment right now, it's really important for us to be optimistic about the power of diversity, because it is powerful.
Angela.
Yeah, I'm just going to riff off of Kimberly and Tiffany. It's powerful and it's beautiful. And I think now acknowledging this, and not even acknowledging, being leaders in this space, all of the hundreds of folks that are on this, we're more important now. Your leadership is more important now than it's been in a long time. So you may feel a little nervous, you may feel a little queasy, but great things are always done when we're a little bit afraid. So thank you for all that y'all are doing.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, the three speakers today, and thank you to all of you who joined us for this webinar. I want to end by reading out what Jessica just typed in the chat. She said, "Thank you. Your knowledge and experiences are inspiring and uplifting. I could not agree more." Thank you very much to all of you, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.